The coach came in late, the way everything came late to Cedar Bend, dragging a tail of dust across the Montana flats like it was in no hurry to deliver whatever it carried. I'd been standing at the depot since noon with my hat in my hands and my horse dozing at the rail, and I'd had a long time to think about the woman stepping down. Her name was Adeline Pratt. I knew the slope of her handwriting better than I knew her face, which I'd never seen, and I'd built a whole quiet hope out of paper and ink over the long winter. A man does that out here. He builds a life from letters because the real one is too empty to look at straight. I should tell you now that nobody in town expected this to go well for me. I could feel them watching from the boardwalk, the way you feel weather coming in your knees. Caleb Mercer, they were thinking, the one who came back from a cattle drive 8 years ago with a dead man's name on him and never quite scrubbed it off, sending all the way back east for a bride because no woman within 100 miles would have him. They weren't wrong about the last part, and they were only half wrong about the first, and half wrong is the kind of thing that can ruin a man slower than a bullet. The door swung open. A woman set her boot on the step and gripped the frame, and the light came down on her hard and plain, and I understood in one breath that this was not the woman from the letters. She was thin in a way that spoke of going without. Her face was marked all over with the small round scars the pox leaves when it lets you live, scattered across her cheeks and her brow like rain on dust. She knew exactly what she looked like. You could tell because she didn't flinch from my eyes the way a pretty woman flinches from being looked at. She just stood there and let me see, the way you'd hold still and let a dog decide about you. "There's been a mistake," she said. Her voice was low and even and it didn't shake, though her hands did. "I'm not Adeline. She ran off the night before the coach left. Got herself a fellow with a store in St. Louis." She breathed in. "You ordered someone prettier than me. I came in her place because I had nowhere else to be and her ticket was already paid." The whole depot had gone quiet. Old Mrs. Renton stopped her broom on the porch of the Mercantile. 2 men outside the saloon turned to watch. They were all waiting for the same thing, for me to put her back on that coach, to be the unwanted man who got the unwanted bride, so the whole sorry arithmetic of Cedar Bend would balance for one more season. And I'll be honest with you, I had every reason and every right to do it. But I looked at that woman, marked and steady and braced for the worst, telling me the truth when a lie would have served her better, and something in my chest came loose that had been bolted down for 8 years. I could only smile. "What's your name?" I asked. "Ruth," she blinked. "Ruth Calloway." "Caleb Mercer." I stepped forward and took her bag before she could argue about it. "You hungry, Ruth? It's a 2-hour ride to the place. He'll have something on and his cooking won't kill you, which is more than folks say about mine." She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign tongue. "You're not, you heard what I said." I heard it. I tied her bag behind the saddle of the wagon and held out my hand to help her up. "You came 2,000 miles on somebody else's ticket and told me the truth in front of the whole town instead of trying to pass yourself off. That tells me what I need to know about you. The rest we can sort out as we go." She didn't take my hand right away. She looked at it, and then she looked at my face like she was checking it for a trick, the way a person does when kindness has only ever come at her with a hook in it. "Unless," I said, "you've got somewhere better to be." No, she didn't. I could see that too. She put her hand in mine, and it was cold and rough, and it gripped harder than I expected, and I helped her up onto the seat, and we rode out of Cedar Bend with the whole town watching the unwanted man drive off with the bride he never ordered. The ranch sat where the river bent, a long, low house of squared logs my father had raised and a barn that had outlived him. Hay meadows ran gold to the foothills. It wasn't grand. It was solid and it was mine, and on a clear evening with the meadowlarks going it was about the closest thing to peace I'd ever found. Eli Birch met us in the yard. He'd been my father's foreman and then mine, 60-some years old and built like a fence post somebody had forgotten to pull, with a face that had given up on smiling around the time Grant took Richmond. He looked at Ruth, and his eyes caught on her scars and then slid off them, the way a careless man's wouldn't, and I gave him credit for that. "This ain't Adeline," Eli said. "This is Ruth," I said. "She'll be staying." Eli chewed on that. "Town's gonna talk." "Town already talks," I said. "About me. Reckon she can stand to be talked about in good company." He grunted and took the horse and didn't say anything else, which from Eli was a warm welcome. Inside, I showed her the room that had been my mother's, empty since the year I came home alone. She set her bag down and stood at the window looking at the mountains going purple, and she didn't cry, though I half expected she might. She just looked, like she was memorizing it in case it got taken away. We married 3 days later at the courthouse, plain and legal, because I told her I wouldn't have her living under my roof with the town inventing worse than the truth. Judge Forsyth read the words quick and tired, and I put my mother's ring on her finger, and when he said I could kiss my bride, I gave her a careful kiss that we both treated like a handshake. Outside the courthouse, a woman I'd known since childhood crossed the street rather than pass close to us. I felt Ruth see it. "That happened on account of me?" she asked quietly. "On account of me," I said. "You're new, you haven't earned their cold yet. Give it time, you'll find it's got nothing to do with your face." The first real thing she learned about me she learned that same night, when Eli poured her a cup of my coffee at supper and watched her face over the rim of his own. I'd made the pot. I always made the pot. Ruth took one sip and went very still, the way you do when you've put something in your mouth that may have died some time ago. "Mr. Mercer," she said with great delicacy, is this coffee?" Eli made a sound I'd never heard him make before. It took me a second to recognize it as a laugh. 8 years, Eli said, wiping his eyes. 8 years I've drunk that man's coffee and never once told him, because telling him would mean he'd want me to drink more of it to prove there's nothing wrong. "You, missus, you're a brave soul," saying it to his face. "I didn't say anything," Ruth protested. "Your face said the whole funeral," Eli told her, and that was the first time I saw her come near to a smile. "I want you to understand something about that coffee, because it matters later, though I didn't know it then. It was the one thing in that house I'd never let anybody fix. My mother had made the coffee. After she passed, I kept making it her way, or what I thought was her way, and somewhere in 8 years of grief I'd turned it into something closer to tar than to comfort, and I defended it like a man defends the last room in a house that's burning. Nobody had ever dared touch it. Ruth filed that away. I didn't see her do it, but she did. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and I have lived through some strange ones. We moved through that house like two people who'd agreed to share a boat and weren't yet sure who'd take which oar. I rose before light, worked till dark, came in too tired to make conversation, and she let me. She didn't crowd me, but things began to be different in small ways, the kind of ways a man notices only after they've added up. The porch step that had wobbled for 3 years stopped wobbling. I found a fresh nail in it and never asked. My shirts, which I'd been mending myself with the grace of a bare sewing, started coming back from the wash with seams that lay flat. The lamp in the front room moved an inch closer to my chair so the light fell right on whatever I was reading. And one morning I poured myself a cup of coffee out of habit, braced for the usual, and it was coffee. Just coffee, dark and clean and good. I stood there holding the cup like it might be a trap. "I changed nothing," Ruth said from the stove, not turning around. "I just rinse the pot, and I roast the beans a touch less, and I throw out yesterday's grounds instead of building on them." A pause. "You'd been building on them, Mr. Caleb, for some time." "How long?" "I'd guess about 8 years." Eli at the table didn't even look up. "Hallelujah," he said to his eggs. I drank the whole cup standing there. I didn't say thank you, not in words because the words wouldn't come right, but I think she heard it anyway in the silence, the way she heard most things. It was Eli in the end who told her about the name. I'd have gotten to it eventually, or maybe I wouldn't have, but one evening when I rode in late, I found the two of them on the porch, and I could tell by the way they went quiet that I'd been the subject. Eli got up and left us to it. Ruth sat with her hands folded and looked out at the dark where the meadowlarks had given over to the night birds. "Eli told me about a Sabelle," she said. I sat down heavy. "Then you know." "I know what Eli knows, which he says isn't the whole of it." She turned to me. "He says a man died on a drive you were running. He says the town never decided whose fault it was, and a thing you don't decide just sits there forever going bad." That was as fair a telling as any I'd heard. A Sabelle had been a hand of mine, young and reckless and likable, and on a river crossing 8 years gone he'd ridden in where I told him not to, chasing a steer worth less than his own neck, and the current took horse and man and gave back only the horse. I'd gone in after him. I've still got the river in my dreams. I came out half-drowned and empty-handed, and I have never once stopped seeing his face go under. There were no witnesses but my own men, and my own men loved me, so when I said what happened the town heard it as a man covering for himself. Asa had no people here to grieve him loud, but he had a way about him that folks remembered fond, and somebody has to carry a death, and they laid it on me because I was the one still standing. Not in the law. The law cleared me in an afternoon. But there's a court that never adjourns out here, the one that meets in the mercantile and the church porch and the saloon, and that court had been deliberating on Caleb Mercer for 8 years, and had never once brought in a verdict, which is its own kind of hanging. "I didn't tell him to follow," I said. "I told him to hold the line. He didn't. I went in after him. I'd go in after him again tomorrow." I looked at my hands. "But there's no way to prove what a dead man heard, and so it just sits there, like you said." Ruth was quiet a while. Then she did something nobody had done since my mother. She reached over and put her marked hand on top of mine, and she didn't pat it or squeeze it like you'd comfort a child. She just left it there, steady, like she was anchoring me to the porch. "A name's a hard thing to carry," she said. "Harder than a face, I think. A face folks decide about you quick and then mostly leave off. A name they decide about you slow and they never leave off." She looked at me. "I'm sorry for both of us." The meadowlarks were long quiet, but I swear one started up again somewhere out in the dark, the way they sometimes do when the moon's bright enough to fool them. I didn't move my hand. Neither did she. And something put down its first root in me that night, slow and stubborn, the way good things grow in hard ground. He came on a Thursday, the way trouble likes a quiet day to spoil. I was mending tack in the yard when a man rode up on a livery horse, dressed too fine for the road, a town suit gone gray with travel dust. He was maybe 45, smooth-shaven, with the kind of soft, handsome face that's never done a day's work and a smile that arrived a half-second before any feeling could have caused it. He swung down without being asked and looked the place over like he was pricing it. "Caleb Mercer," he said. "It wasn't a question." "That's me." "Royce Hatcher." He let the name sit, watching my face for the recognition he expected. "Asa Bell was my half-brother, same mother, God rest her. I've come a long way to settle what was left unsettled when you let him drown." I'll tell you the truth, my first feeling wasn't anger. It was something closer to a sick relief, the way you feel when a fever finally breaks into the open. 8 years of a thing with no face, and here at last was a face for it. "Asa never spoke of a brother," I said. "Asa and I were estranged." Hatcher's smile didn't waver. "Doesn't change the blood, doesn't change what's owed." He drew a folded paper from his coat and held it out like a gift. "I've filed for a hearing. The town council, the church board, anyone with a memory of my brother. I mean to lay out plainly what kind of man runs another to his death and walks free, and I mean to ask for what's just this land as a blood payment or its worth in coin." He glanced at the house, at the barn, at the meadows running gold to the hills. "I'd take the land. It's a fair sight prettier than money." I heard the door behind me. Ruth had come out onto the porch with a dish towel still in her hands, and she'd gone as still as I'd ever seen her go, stiller than at the depot, stiller than at the courthouse. She was looking at Royce Hatcher like a woman who'd seen a ghost, except a ghost would have frightened her less, because a ghost can't take anything from you twice. Hatcher tipped his hat to her, all courtesy. "Ma'am." She didn't answer. She turned and went back inside. "My wife," I said. "My condolences," Hatcher said pleasantly, and the soft cruelty of it told me more about him than anything yet. He mounted up. "3 days, Mr. Mercer. The town hall. Bring whatever conscience you've got left." And he rode off easy, like a man who'd already won and was only riding out to let the news catch up to it. I found Ruth in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the table. "You know him," I said. She didn't lie to me. She never once lied to me. "I think I do." Her voice was unsteady now in a way it hadn't been even when she stepped down off that coach to tell a stranger she wasn't his bride. "Give me a little time, Caleb. I need to be sure before I say a thing that can't be unsaid. A wrong word from me would only hand him a weapon." She looked up. "Will you trust me 3 days?" I'd known the woman a matter of weeks. I'd trust her with the last breath in my body, and the knowing of that was its own kind of fright. 3 days, I said. He was good at it. I'll give the devil that. By Friday, Royce Hatcher had taken a room at the boarding house and made himself the most listened-to man in Cedar Bend. He didn't bluster. He grieved, openly and well, a sorrowing brother come at last to honor a forgotten boy, and grief is the easiest thing in the world to believe because everybody's carrying some of their own. He bought no drinks and made no threats. He just sat in the mercantile with his hat over his heart and told the story of poor young Asa, and let the town's 8-year-old doubt curdle, in the warmth of his telling, into something that looked very much like certainty. I felt it the way you feel the temperature drop before a storm. Men who'd nodded to me for years found the far side of the street. The church board sent word, regretful and cool, that perhaps the Mercer pew might sit empty until the matter was resolved. Eli came back from town Saturday with his jaw set hard. "They're saying it out loud now," he told me, "not just thinking it. Hatcher's given them leave to say it out loud, and once a thing's said out loud a few times, folks forget it was ever only a maybe." He spat. "Reverend Coombs all but called you a murderer from his own porch. To my face. 62 years I've kept off a man's neck, Caleb. I came near to breaking my own record." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of Ruth's good coffee going cold in front of me, and somewhere past midnight she came out in her shawl and sat across from me, and we didn't speak for a long while. "I know what he is," she said finally. "I've been sure since the second day, but I made myself walk it through because I won't stand up in front of that town on a feeling." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "His name isn't Hatcher, or it might be. I don't know what he was born. When I knew him, he called himself Crane, Mr. Crane. He came to our town in Ohio the winter the pox went through, the winter it took my mother and my 2 brothers and left me looking like this." She touched her own cheek, not for pity, just placing the year. "He came offering a kindness. He ran a kind of marriage agency," he said. "He'd match poor girls with good men out west, respectable men, lonely men, and arrange their passage, and all it cost the family was a small bond against the girl's good conduct. My father, half mad with grief and 3 coffins to pay for, gave him near everything we had left. So did a dozen other families. And the husbands. There were no husbands. There was no agency. There were a few real men he'd write to make the thing look true. And there were a great many girls put on coaches to places where nobody was waiting with a bond paid that he kept." Her jaw tightened. "I never got on the coach. I was sick still and ugly with it, and he decided I wasn't worth the trouble of the journey and he left me behind. That's the only reason I'm sitting here. He looked at this face and decided I was beneath even his cheating." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh and not quite. "Funny. It's the same calculation you made at the depot, only you came out the opposite side of it." I reached across and took her hand. "He reads the papers," I said slowly, understanding it now. "Obituaries, old scandals. He finds a death with no people to defend it and a man with a bad name and no proof, and he turns up as the grieving kin. He builds on yesterday's grounds," Ruth said, and for just a second her eyes had a flash of something fierce in them. "Same as you and your coffee. Takes an old bitter thing nobody threw out and makes a fresh poison of it. Can you prove any of it? I can stand up and say it. She held my gaze. And I tracked down one more thing these 3 days. A girl from our town, Sarah Prout, who did get on his coach and got herself sent back when there was nobody to meet her. She married a freighter and she lives 2 days from here in Helena. I sent word the morning Hatcher came. If she'll come, and Sarah Prout is not a forgiving woman, Caleb, he made sure of that, then it's not just my word against a grieving brother's. It's 2 women who knew his face under another name. She squeezed my hand. But there's a risk in it, I have to tell you plain. If I stand up and I'm wrong about him in any small thing, if my voice shakes and they read it as a liar's shake, I don't just fail to save you. I hand the whole town proof that the murderer married a swindler and we both go down together. The hearing was Monday, 2 days. I felt the river dream pulling at me even awake. I made up my mind to sign it over. I want you to understand why, because I think it's the only foolish thing I did in this whole business, and a man ought to own his foolishness same as anything else. I'd watched 8 years of cold finally come to a head, and now it had reached past me to touch her, Ruth, who'd done nothing but tell the truth and fix my coffee and put a nail in my porch step and a root in my chest. I couldn't stand to see her marked face drag through that hall, couldn't stand the thought of Royce Hatcher's soft smile, while 2 of his victims begged a jury of farmers to believe them over him. Land is land. I told myself I could lose the land and we could go somewhere my name had never traveled and start clean, the 2 of us, and that was the closest I'd come in 8 years to wanting a future bad enough to run toward it. Sunday night I told her. I had the deed out on the table. I'll meet him in the morning before the hearing, I said. Give him the place. He takes it and he's gone, and you never have to stand up in front of those people. We'll go west. I've got a little put by. I'd rather have you whole and unshamed in a strange town than win and watch this one hurt you. Ruth looked at the deed for a long moment. Then she picked it up, folded it, and set it on the high shelf over the stove, out of my reach without a chair, the same shelf where she kept the things she didn't want spoiled. No, she said. Ruth, you listen to me, Caleb Mercer, because I've only got the one thing to say and I need you to hear all of it. She came around the table and stood in front of me. 8 years you've let this town hold a verdict over you they never had the courage or the proof to deliver. You let them, because somewhere in you half believe you deserve it, on account of you came out of that river and a sad didn't. I know that look. I wore it for years over a sickness that wasn't my fault either. Her voice didn't rise. It went lower and harder like a held nerve. If you sign that paper, you don't just give him the land. You tell every soul in Cedar Bend that the talk was true. You confess. You let a thief carry off your name as well as your acres, and you teach me that the man She stopped, started again. You teach me the man I chose runs from the hard thing when it gets close to me, and I didn't cross 2,000 miles on a dead girl's ticket to marry a man who runs. I sat very still. It could go bad. It could, she didn't soften it, but I would rather lose standing beside you in the truth than win out there in a clean, strange town with your name still rotting behind us. A name doesn't clear itself by running, Caleb. It clears by somebody standing up. She put her marked hand flat against my chest. You stood up for me at that depot in front of the whole town when it cost you to do it. Let me stand up for you. That's the whole of a marriage, isn't it? Taking turns standing up. I have been hit hard a few times in my life, by horses and by men, and once by a falling barn beam. None of it rang my bones the way those words did. I covered her hand with mine. All right, I said, we stand up. The town hall was full to the walls Monday morning. They'd come for a hanging and everything but rope. I could see it in the faces, that hungry, righteous, half-ashamed look a crowd gets when it's decided to be cruel and dressed it up as justice. Royce Hatcher sat at the front in his gray suit, hat over his heart, grief arranged on his face like a man arranges flowers. The council sat at a long table. Reverend Coombs sat with them, which told you which way the wind was set to blow. They let Hatcher speak first, and he was magnificent at it. He wept, a little at the right moment. He spoke of a boy who'd left home young and died alone in a cold river while the man responsible swam to shore and built a life on the very ground that should have been bought with shame. He asked for no money. He said money couldn't buy back a brother. He asked only that Cedar Bend look at last at the truth it had let slide for 8 years and do what was right. By the time he sat down, half the hall was nodding and a woman near the back was crying along with him. Then they called on me, and I stood, and I told them the same thing I'd told them 8 years before in the same words, because the truth doesn't get new words just because nobody believed the old ones. I told them I'd ordered a SA to hold the line. I told them he went in anyway. I told them I went in after him, and the river was stronger than both of us. And I watched it land on the same wall of doubt it had broken against for 8 years, because I had no proof. I had only my word, and my word was the thing on trial. Reverend Coombs leaned forward. And is there anyone who can speak to your character, Mr. Mercer, beyond your own hired men? That's when Ruth stood up. She stood up in the middle of that packed and hostile hall, marked face lifted, hands folded in front of her so no one could see them shake, and she waited until every eye had found her and the whispering had run itself out. She didn't look at me. She looked at Royce Hatcher. "My name is Ruth Mercer," she said. "I came here a stranger and I'll speak as one, with nothing to gain but my husband's good name, which is the only thing of his I care to keep." She took a breath. "Before I came here, I lived in Marston, Ohio. In the winter of '74, the smallpox came through and took my mother and my 2 brothers and left me with this face. And that same winter, a man came to Marston calling himself Mr. Crane. He ran a marriage agency," he said. "He matched poor girls with husbands out west and arranged their passage, and all it cost a family was a bond against the girl's conduct, paid up front." She let that hang. "He took near everything my grieving father had left. He took the same from a dozen families. There were no husbands. There was no agency. There were coaches that carried girls to towns where no one waited, and a bond he kept, and a man who rode on to the next place with a new sad story to tell." The hall had gone dead quiet. Hatcher's smile was still in place, but it had stopped moving, the way a thing stops moving when it's listening hard. "That man," Ruth said, and now she pointed and her arm was steady as a rifle rest, "is sitting in the front row of this room, dressed in gray, telling you he's a grieving brother. He told me he was a marriage broker. He told you he's the kin of a Sabelle. He goes town to town reading the deaths in the papers, finding the ones with no family to defend them and a man already wearing the blame, and he turns up wearing a black armband to collect on grief that was never his." She turned to the council. "He left me behind in Ohio because he judged my face not worth the cost of the coach. I expect that's the only honest decision he's made in his life. And it's the reason I'm standing here today to name him." Hatcher rose, smooth as ever. "This is a sad woman and a marked one," he said, gentle, terrible, "married to a desperate man. Of course she'll say anything." The doors at the back of the hall opened. A woman walked in, road-worn and hard-faced, a big freighter of a husband a step behind her. She came up the center aisle without being asked and stopped where everyone could see her, and she looked at Royce Hatcher, and the look on her face was 8 years of a particular kind of hate. "Sarah Prout," she said to the room, not to him. "Marston, Ohio. I got on Mr. Crane's coach in the winter of '74, rode it 11 days to a town in Kansas where the husband he'd promised me did not exist and never had. I'd have starved or worse if a freighter hadn't taken pity." She set her hand on the big man's arm. "That's him. That's Crane. I'd know that smile in my grave." She looked at the council. "Ask him to roll up his left sleeve. He's got a brand on the wrist. A girl's father caught up to him in Missouri and laid a hot iron to him before the law pulled the man off. He won't show you. He's worn long sleeves in August for 7 years." The hall came apart then, the way a held thing does. Royce Hatcher, Crane, made it 3 steps toward the door before 2 farmers who'd been nodding along to his grief an hour before took him by the arms, and when they pushed his left sleeve up there it was, an old puckered scar in the rough shape of a letter. The kind of mark a man carries the way I carried my river and Ruth carried her pox. We all of us get marked. It's only what we did to earn it that differs. I never said another word in that hall. I didn't need to. The truth had its own legs now and it walked on without me. They held Crane for the marshal. The council's apology when it came was a slow and shamefaced thing, dribbled out over weeks in tipped hats and offered hands and a pew that was suddenly, urgently available. Reverend Coombs came out to the ranch himself, hat in hand, and managed to say he'd spoken in haste, and I let him say it, and I poured him a cup of Ruth's coffee, and that was as near to vengeance as I cared to take. We were married again in the spring, by choice this time, in the meadow behind the house where the grass ran gold to the hills and the meadowlarks made a racket fit to drown the vows. No courthouse. No reading quick and tired. Eli stood up beside me in a collar that was strangling him, and Sarah Prout came down from Helena with her freighter, and half the town came too, which I found I could forgive them for mostly. Ruth wore wildflowers in her hair and her marked face was turned up to the sun without a shadow of flinch in it, and I thought she was the finest thing I'd ever seen, and I told her so, and she told me my eyesight had always been suspect, which was her way of saying thank you. The name healed slow, the way Ruth said it would, not in one grand stroke but in 1,000 small ones, a nod here, a borrowed tool there, a man stopping by to talk cattle who'd crossed the street to avoid me a year before. A ruined name doesn't get rebuilt by the man who lost it, I learned. It gets rebuilt by the ones who stand near him until the town gets used to seeing him stood near. Eli stood near. Ruth stood near. After a while the standing near was just the shape of things, and the old verdict that had never been delivered finally, quietly, expired for lack of anyone willing to second it. Eli, the old fence post, surprised us all by going soft in his last years, soft enough to take a second cup of coffee unprompted, and to weep openly the morning our boy was born, a fat, furious, dark-haired thing we named Asa, because Ruth said a good name oughtn't be left to rot on a thief's tongue, and ought to belong to somebody who'd carry it clean. I held that boy and thought about a river, and for the first time in 9 years the dream let go of me. There's one more thing I'll tell you, because Ruth made me promise to tell it whole. Years on, we drove a wagon into Cedar Bend to meet a coach, the way I'd once met a coach for a bride I never got. We were only there for parcels. But Ruth stood on the depot platform looking at the spot where she'd stepped down all those years before, and she got quiet in the way that meant something was working in her. "I want to ask you a thing," she said, "and I want the true answer, not the kind one." She didn't look at me. That first day, when I stepped down and told you what I was, you smiled. I've wondered 8 years what a man finds to smile about, getting handed the wrong bride, the marked one, the leftover. Were you laughing at the joke of it, at your own bad luck? I took a long while to answer, because she'd asked for the true thing, and the true thing wanted care. I smiled, I said, because the woman they all expected to ruin me had just told me the truth when a lie would have served her, and stood there and let me look at her without once asking me to pretend. I'd spent 8 years among people who decided about me and never once let me see them do it. And here was someone who put it all out in the open in the first breath and let the chips fall. I turned her to face me, my hand on her marked cheek where it had rested 10,000 times by then. "You think I got handed the wrong bride and made the best of her, but I want you to hear me say it once plain on the same boards where you said your piece. I never wanted Prettier. Prettier would have lied to me. Prettier would have run when Crane came smiling, the way the first one ran from a man with a bad name." I shook my head. "I didn't settle for you, Ruth. The whole town watched me get exactly what I needed and call it bad luck, and I was the only one fool enough to believe them for a minute. You weren't the wrong bride. You were the only right one, and I knew it the second you opened your mouth." She didn't say anything for a while. The meadowlarks were going somewhere out past the rail. Then she put her hand over mine, the way she had that first night on the porch, steady, anchoring. "No," she said quietly, "I think we finally got it right. The coach came in late, the way everything came late to Cedar Bend, and we loaded our parcels and drove home along the river that didn't haunt me anymore. Two marked people who'd been counted out and had counted themselves back in. And the sun came down gold on the meadows running up to the hills, and everything was just exactly as it should be. "You ordered someone prettier than me," she'd said, "that first dust-choked day." And God help me. All I could do was smile, because even then, before I had the words for it, some part of me already knew the truth I'd spend a lifetime grateful for, that the worth of a person was never in being wanted by somebody, but in being chosen freely by someone who'd seen the whole of you and stayed.